Hello everyone. We've already studied this topic before. I'm sure that one of the professors from physiology have taught you introduction to endocrinology. It's a pretty simple module and quite interesting course. And since this is a revision, it won't take long and would be a very simple topic. So starting on, we need to understand what endocrinology basically is and why do we need to understand this system. When we talk about this system, you need to know that how does your body know when to grow, when to sleep, when to feel hungry, or even when to reproduce. So the answer is obviously the system of endocrine. Again, like I've taught you guys before, it is very important that you know the definitions of whatever terminologies are being asked in your offspring, especially during your vivas. You need to be very fluent and well versed with the medical terminologies. Kindly avoid any layman terms. So when we talk about endocrinology, it is the study of the endocrine system, which is a network of glands and tissues that produce and release these hormones. So what do these hormones basically do? They're basically chemical messengers that travel throughout the bloodstream to regulate various bodily functions, including your metabolism, growth, development, and reproduction. So the key molecule here is the hormone, right? And this travels throughout your body, acts on certain organs or regions, and carries out its relevant function. So this is pretty much it. Moving on. Now, when you look at this slide, this is extremely important. It may show up in your observed offspring in the form of a viral. However, it may also show up in your unobserved stations in the form of a cross match, fill in the blanks, or even short answer questions. So, whenever I uh, tell you guys to study the differences, it's really important that you do. Starting on with the endocrine glands, what are the endocrine glands? They're ductless glands. They do not have ducts. On the contrary, when you talk about the exocrine glands, they have ducts, right? Now, what exactly do endocrine glands do? The function is that they secrete hormones primarily. However, when you move on to the exocrine glands, instead of hormones, they secrete other substances such as sweat, enzymes, mucus, and sebum. Now, if they do not have any ducts, talking about endocrine glands, how do they function? They directly release the products into the bloodstream. However, when you talk about exocrine glands, they're released to an internal organ or the external surface. So you basically have a duct which carries your substance and then eventually it reaches the target organ or the external surface and then it releases it there. Again, examples are very important. When we talk about endocrine glands, the examples are your thyroid gland, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland. And when we talk about exocrine glands, the examples are esophageal, liver, and salivary glands. Again, a very important question, a BCB question that may show up, that which of the two control long-term activity and which of the two controls short-term activity. So exocrine glands, they control short-term activity, endocrine glands, they control long-term activity. Naturally, we talk about hormones. Hormones basically, they take time to act with the help of receptors and so on the pathway it continues. So obviously it's a long-term action, right? When you talk about short-term activity of exocrine glands, sebum, sweat, mucus, this is all immediate, right? So that is how you put up your concept about this. Eventually, what do these substances do when they reach the target organs? Endocrine glands, they basically affect your metabolism, growth and development. These are the key functions. However, when you talk about exocrine glands, with the help of sweat, sebum, mucus, and all of that, they regulate your body temperature, which is the main function of these glands. Now, some of the pictures have also been provided here. These are very important, and like I told you guys before, you do not have to stick to the pictures that are being provided in the slides or are there in your guidance. You have to have a vast knowledge. Which is that if you have a good theoretical concept, no matter what picture shows up from what source, you'll always be able to answer it, right? Moving on. Again, a picture like this can show up where you have to label the diagram. These are all of the glands that you should study. In the introduction lecture, we shall cover it very slightly, each of these glands. However, later on, individually, we'll study the functions and the activity and the clinical significance of each of these glands individually. So here you have is the pineal gland. Then moving on, we have the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Um, then we have is the thyroid and the parathyroid gland right over here, the thymus, the pancreas. These are your adrenal glands which lie on top of your kidney. Then you have the ovaries, and this is obviously your uterus, and inside the uterus you have your placenta during pregnancy, of course. Then a picture of a male has also been provided, similar uh, organs to label, apart from the reproductive organs, of course, the uterus and the ovary has been replaced by the testicle. Moving on to the exocrine glands, eyes, which produce tears, of course, in your mouth, which produces saliva. Again, your questions can also show up in the form of this, like what do eyes do, what kind of secretions do they produce, what does the mouth do. When you talk about the breasts, it produces milk. Skin, it produces sweat or sebum. Liver, bile, stomach, enzymes. Your intestines, they produce mucus, and the pancreas, they produce all different kinds of juices. So again, when we talk about all of these secretions, they provide short-term activity, right? Their result and function is very immediate. Like for example, when you talk about breasts, they produce milk, right? So it can immediately provide nutrition to the baby, for example, and it's not long-term. So this is how we understand this concept. Now, this here is extremely important, which is the classification. When you talk about the classification, we understand that we have different kinds of hormones here. We have steroid hormones, we have mind hormones, we have peptide hormones, and protein hormones. So, when we talk about the steroid hormones are basically derived from cholesterol. They're lipid soluble and they act on intracellular receptors. You always need to know the examples, right? Again, it can show up in Reviva or in your unobserved auspices. Examples of steroid hormones are cortisol and estrogen. Testosterone and progesterone are also there. Then we move on to the amino acid derivatives, right? Amino acid derivatives, they're derived basically from tyrosine. Example, thyroxine and adrenaline, right? Then we move on to the peptide hormones. When we talk about the peptide hormones, they're made of obviously amino acids. Like amino acids are the building blocks and they join together to form an entire protein molecule. Again, they're water soluble, they act via cell surface receptors, and examples include insulin and uh, growth hormone, right? Oxytocin and vasopressin. This is very important. They both consist of only 9 amino acid residues, right? Then moving on, we also have glycoprotein hormones. These are again glycoprotein in nature. They're conjugated proteins. Their carbohydrate groups are mannose, galactose, and fructose. Um, there's a spelling mistake here. This is fructose. Examples we have are luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, an important feature here is that you guys need to know that water soluble hormones are membrane receptors. However, lipid soluble are intracellular receptors. This is something that you need to, they have intracellular receptors. This is something you guys need to understand. This determines how the hormone basically acts. Again, a very important but a very basic and simple slide about autocrines and paracrines. What are autocrines and paracrines? Autocrines are basically chemicals that exert their effect on the same cell. Like for example, there was a particular cell, it released it, but it released it for its own self, right? To perform any of its own functions, right? When you talk about paracrines, what paracrines do is that they release their substance However, rather than acting on the cell itself, which secreted it, it travels a certain distance, and its functions are on another cell. So this is the difference between an autocrine and a paracrine, right? Again, these are not considered hormones, since hormones are long distance chemical signals. These are short, so these are not considered hormones. These are completely different category of substances. Again, this is very important when we talk about the second messenger system. I remember this showed up during my MBBS when I was in my first year, in fact, and the entire picture was given, and I was supposed to Google it and explain how a second messenger system primarily works. Now, when you look at the cyclic AMP pathway, this is the cyclic AMP pathway. What happens is that some of the hormones, they cannot enter the cell. So what do? They use the system which is known as the second messenger system. When you talk about the second messenger system, it has certain steps to it, right? I'll not go into a lot of detail, but in order to simplify this, what we need to understand is that first of all, what really happens is that this is your hormone here, right? And this is your receptor. Now, this hormone basically binds to your receptor. Later on, this activates your G protein. This G protein, which was previously inactive, right? This was activated by the binding of the hormone to the receptor. Once the binding has taken place, what happens is that the GTP molecule here is converted into a GTP molecule, right? Then later on, what this does is it activates the adenylate cyclase, this over here, right? This, once activated, converts ATP to CAMP, right? This CAMP then triggers the rest of the response of the cell, right? Which includes activation of enzymes, stimulation of cellular secretions, and opening of ion channels. So this entire process going on is like a chain, in the form of a chain, where one action stimulates another action which is coming ahead, right? Now, which hormones they work through the second messenger system? These are the examples here. Again, these are very important. These include catecholamines, ACTH, FSH, LH, glucagon, PTH, TSH, and calcitonin, right? Again, when you talk about simultaneously other hormones also acting, not just one hormone is acting at one time, but there's another one as well. This was the first messenger here, this is the second messenger here, right? So this saves up time. Now they may also ask you that where are these receptors exactly located? In or on the surface of the cell membrane. The membrane receptors are specifically mostly for the protein, peptide, and catecholamine hormones in the cell cytoplasm. So the primary receptors for the different steroid hormones are found mainly in the cytoplasm. In the cell nucleus, the receptors for the thyroid hormones are found in the nucleus and are believed to be located in direct association with one or more of the chromosomes, right? So it may look quite complicated, but the process is pretty simple. All you need to do is look at the diagram, understand each of these key steps, right? What gets activated by what process, what are the examples of the hormones which act through the system. And so it won't be so difficult to understand. Again, if you look at this is your cytoplasm and this is your extracellular fluid. Again, this. This slide is basically about, we'll talk about this. This slide basically explains how hormones can have several types of effects, right? They can have four different types of effects if we just summarize this slide. Number one is stimulatory, which is increasing activity. Number two, inhibitory, which is decreasing activity. Number three, regulatory, which is maintaining your homeostasis. And tropic effects, which is they act on other glands, right? So when you look over here, When we talk about upregulation is when target cells form more receptors in response to the hormones, right? Downregulation is basically when target cells they lose receptors. Naturally, when there are no receptors, the hormones are not going to bind and none of the functions will take place. So they may ask you in your vivas that how does downregulation basically take place. One of the examples is already given that the target cells they just may lose their receptors, right? By losing receptors, I mean destruction by lysosomes, right? There may also be a decreased production of receptors, right? There may also be an inactivation of some receptors by some of the processes. There may also be an inactivation of some of the intracellular signaling molecules, right? Okay. Uh, Again, I think this is a common understanding. If someone asks you that how exactly are irrelevant or the ones which have already been used, hormones removed from the body eventually. They may bind with the tissues, they may be metabolically destroyed by the tissues, they may be excreted out by the liver into the bile, and they may also be excreted by the kidneys into the liver. So these are the basic processes, right? Okay. Again, this may look like a very complicated slide, but this is also pretty simple. Three different mechanisms of hormonal release have been provided here. When you talk about uh, humoral is about changes in blood levels. Example, glucose is converted by the help of insulin, right? So humoral is primarily in response to changing levels of ions or nutrients in the blood. Then neural control. When you talk about the neural control, which is right here, what happens is there's a nervous system input, stimulation by nerves, right? Example, whenever there's stress, there is release of cortisol, right? So that's a neural response. Then there's another one where one hormone stimulates another. This is the hypothalamic pituitary axis. This is stimulation received from other hormones. So over here what happens is that the key features are three. The prime organ involved here is hypothalamus. Hypothalamus would release certain hormones. We'll study these in details, right? Which will then stimulate the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland, in response to this, will release another hormone, right? Once the hormone is released, it may act on one of these three organs eventually: thyroid, adrenal cortex, or the gonads. If it acts on the thyroid gland, it would stimulate the production of thyroid hormones T3, T4. If it acts on the adrenal cortex, the adrenal hormones, and if it acts on the gonads or the testes, it may result in the release of testosterone. What exactly is happening here is that one hormone release is stimulating the production of another kind of hormone. So this is the hormonal stimulation. So I hope this is pretty simple. This is the humoral response, which is the changes in blood levels, right? Then over here is the neural, pretty simple in response to the stimulation of nerves. And over here, hormonal, which means that stimulation is received from other hormones, right? So it's like a chain reaction. We've already studied this before. Uh, Again, whenever someone asks you what are the functions, you need to be well versed and fluent and have great clarity over how to provide the key uh, points of the functions. Very important, as discussed before, metabolism, homeostasis, which is the constant internal balance of your body, such as maintaining blood pressure, regulation of blood sugar, fluid and electrolyte balance, and body temperature. Right? Growth and development, sexual function, reproduction, sleep-wake cycle, mood, body temperature, and appetite. Again, the table that has been provided here is a summary of each of your endocrine glands, right? And what I have provided here are the list of hormones that each of these glands produce, the target tissues, and the response. This slide is extremely important. A lot of easy questions are made from here. For example, before going into the details and before moving step by step, they may ask you in your BCQ that which of the following hormones are produced by the posterior pituitary gland, right? So we know that there are only two, antidiuretic hormone or oxytocin. They may also ask you what is the other name of antidiuretic hormone or ADH, it's vasopressin. So these are the kind of questions, although these are pretty simple. What are more challenging are the clinical scenarios, but this is how they show up. So when you talk about the pituitary gland, there are two parts to it, the interior and the posterior, right? This is the interior part here and this is the posterior part here. When you talk about the interior part, it produces your growth hormone. Where does it act? Most of the tissues. Obviously, when you talk about growth, it is general, right? I can't really say that the growth hormone would act on a certain organ and only cause growth of that particular region. Growth has to be uniform. So, in most tissues, what does it do? Increases gene expression, breakdown of lipids, and reduce of fatty acids from cells, increases blood glucose levels, etc. Moving, thyroid stimulating hormone. Again, obviously, thyroid gland, release of thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T3 and T4. ACTH. ACTH act on adrenal cortex. Okay, and then this increases secretion of glucocorticoid hormones such as cortisol, increases skin pigmentation, etc. MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Melanocytes obviously are in skin, which provide that particular pigmentation that you have in your skin, right? Then you have is a luteinizing hormone. Naturally, would act on the ovary in females and the testis in males. This promotes ovulation and progesterone production in ovary, promotes testosterone synthesis and support for sperm cell production in testes. Follicle stimulated hormone. Where would they act? In the ovaries. Again, the follicles. Promotes follicle maturation and estrogen secretion in ovary. And what does it do in the males? It promotes sperm cell production in testes. Prolactin, right? Very important. What does it do? Again, ovaries and primarily the mammary glands in females and also the testes in males. It stimulates milk production and prolongs progesterone secretion following ovulation and during pregnancy in women. And in males, however, it increases the sensitivity to luteinizing hormones. When you talk about the posterior part of the gland, the antidiuretic hormone again obviously acts on the kidney. What does it do? It conserves water and constricts your blood vessels, right? So whenever you're losing water, right? So what basically this hormone does is that it conserves your water, reabsorbs it. When you talk about oxytocin, it acts on the uterus and the mammary gland. In the uterus, increases your uterine contractions with the help of positive feedback. However, in mammary glands, it causes the milk letdown, production of milk, right? Another important one, the thyroid gland. Very simple, two hormones, thyroid hormones and the calcitonin. Thyroid hormone, again, you need to understand that since thyroid hormone, again, it controls various metabolic activities of your body, it acts on more cells of your body. However, calcitonin primarily acts on the blood. Why? Because what calcitonin does is that it prevents large increase in blood calcium levels, right? And decreases the rate of bone breakdown, right? So this is what it does, right? So whenever there is increased calcium in your body, this conserves it. Thyroid hormones increase metabolic rates essential for normal process of growth and maturation, as discussed before. Parathyroid hormone, थायराइड के साथ ही अटैच हुआ है पैराथायराइड, बोन्स और किडनीज का एक्ट करता है. व्हाट डज इट डू? इंक्रीजेस रेट ऑफ बोन ब्रेकडाउन बाय osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are basically cells which cause breakdown, right? और जो आपके osteoblasts होते हैं वो बिल्डिंग सेल्स होते हैं आपके ना, और ये ब्रेकडाउन वाले सेल्स होते हैं osteoclasts. Increases vitamin D synthesis and essential for maintenance of normal blood pressure levels. Then we move on to this adrenal gland, which is located on the top of the kidney. Adrenal medulla, ये जो middle वाला part is your medulla. This primarily contains epinephrine, mostly, but norepinephrine can also be there. इसके बहुत सारे activities होते हैं, you guys need to study this. Heart vessels के लिए heart cells में काम करता है, increases cardiac output, increases blood flow to skeletal muscles and heart, increases release of glucose and fatty acids into blood in general, repairs body activity, etc. ये जो आपका cortex है, ये बहुत important है. पहले आपके पास आता है mineralocorticoid. आपसे हमेशा पूछ सकते हैं कि mineralocorticoids के आप एग्जाम्पल देंगे. एग्जाम्पल इज एल्डोस्टेरोन. ठीक है, एल्डोस्टेरोन बेसिकली आपका क्या करता है, सोडियम ट्रांसपोर्ट बढ़ाता है इनटू बॉडी. ठीक है, और पोटेशियम की एक्सक्रीशन ज़्यादा करता है, और सेकेंडरीली फेवर करता है वाटर की रिटेंशन. जब आपके कोर्टिसोल की बात करते हैं, द सेकंड कैटेगरी ऑफ हार्मोन्स रिलीज बाय एड्रेनल कॉर्टेक्स इज द ग्लूकोकॉर्टिकॉइड. एग्जांपल कोर्टिसोल, इट इज स्ट्रेस हार्मोन. ये क्या करता है, इंक्रीज फैट एंड प्रोटीन ब्रेकडाउन. ठीक है, बिकॉज आप जब नेचुरली स्ट्रेस की सिचुएशन में होते हैं, आपको एनर्जी की जरूरत है. तो ये कोर्टिसोल जब रिलीज होता है, तो ये आपके सारे जो एनर्जी रिलेटेड मॉलिक्यूल्स हैं, प्रोटीन हो गया, आपका फैट हो गया, इसका ब्रेक डाउन कराएगा, ग्लूकोज की सिंथेसिस कराएगा, अमाइनो एसिड आपके बिल्डिंग ब्लॉक्स पड़े हुए थे, उसकी सिंथेसिस कराएगा, ताकि इन सारे प्रोसेस से आपको एनर्जी मिल सके. In the case of flight or fighters. I hope that makes sense. When you talk about the adrenal androgens, they are again present in most tissues. They are insignificant in males. They increase female sexual drive, growth of pubic and isolated hair. Last but not the least, I think we actually have it. Now, before that, we have pancreas. Pancreas of the character insulin and glucagon. I think this is very easy. Insulin आपको basically क्या करता है, whenever you had a heavy meal, blood glucose level increases in your blood, right? So what it does is that it increases the uptake and the use of glucose by your tissues, so that the blood glucose level is reduced. However, on the contrary, when you talk about the glucagon, which primarily acts on the liver, what it does is that in fasting state, it increases the breakdown of glycogen, so that free glucose is available in the circulatory system, right? Very simple. Your reproductive organs क्या करेंगे आपके, when talk about the testes, they produce testosterone, aids in sperm cell production, maintenance of functional reproductive organs and secondary sexual characteristics. Ovaries, estrogen और progesterone produce करती हैं most tissues में. It aids in uterine and mammary gland development and function, external genitalia structure, secondary sexual characteristics. Again, uterus, ovaries and inflamed tissues produce prostaglandins. Prostaglandins आप क्या करते हैं, inflammatory responses को activate करते हैं, और uterine contractions और ovulation को stimulate करते हैं और increase. फिर आपका आता है thymus. हार्मोन कौन सा प्रोड्यूस करेगा, thymus. इम्यून टिश्यूज में आता है, promotes immune system development and function. When we talk about the pineal gland आपको कौन सा हार्मोन प्रोड्यूस करेगा, melatonin, right? It inhibits secretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone, thereby inhibiting reproduction. Okay. Again, a very good summary of all of the hormones, each of the glands, and what are the examples of the hormones which are being produced. Pineal gland, thyroid and parathyroid. Stomach में कौन से होते हैं, gastrin, ghrelin. Again, I've taught you guys this before in your GIT module. Ghrelin is a hunger hormone. Remember this, right? Then you have pancreas, which produce insulin, glucagon, and somatostatin. Kidneys, testes, uterus, ovary, adrenal, liver, thymus, pituitary gland, and hypothalamus. Make sure that you go through these pictures really well and understand and learn each of these examples and the organs. A very important slide. Now, whenever you go through certain processes inside your body, due to certain circumstances, at times you may need to accelerate a certain process, right? And at times when a hormone or a substance is in excess and can cause harm to the body, its production has to be hindered down or reduced. So in order to cater to both of these two problems, we have the positive feedback and the negative feedback, right? When we talk about the negative feedback, it is when a substance has excessively increased in your body. The example here is, for example, you were in a state of stress, right? Your hypothalamus, it produces cortisol releasing hormone. Then we have this anterior pituitary, which releases the adrenal corticotropin hormone, which acted on your adrenal gland and or cause the release of cortisol, right? And again, like I told you before, what cortisol does is that it increases your fat and protein breakdown and causes increased synthesis of glucose. However, uh, due to certain circumstances, your stress kept increasing. It kept increasing and increasing, and so did the cortisol level. Now we only need this hormone to a limit. Otherwise, excessive amount of protein and fat breakdown can occur. So when this happens, when cortisol has reached a certain upper limit, this itself causes a negative feedback. This would send a signal back to the hypothalamus, telling the hypothalamus to stop producing CRH. And eventually, when CRH, which was stimulating the next hormone, is reduced, the other hormone won't even be released, and eventually the cortisol production would stop. So, this is how you understand and explain the negative feedback system to your examiners. I hope this is clear. Positive feedback, on the contrary, is when you need it to accelerate or to increase the speed of a certain process. The example here given is of estrogen and progesterone, right? It may be needed in the uterus to increase the contractions or whatever the process is. Another very good example is of oxytocin being produced and stimulated and more being released to increase lactation, right? So this is the positive feedback. Positive feedback is generally less common, but some hormones stimulate their own release, such as the surge in LH during the pre-ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle to cause ovulation. That is the rupture of follicles to release an egg. Again, these are certain examples. Some of the examples have already been provided. A very classic example of negative feedback is also blood glucose regulation. So what basically happens is that when blood sugar level rises, especially after a heavy meal, insulin is released by your body, causing cells to take up your glucose, which eventually then lowers your blood sugar levels. On the contrary, when blood sugar levels fall, glucagon is released, which causes the glycogen present in the liver to produce glucose, raising the blood sugar level. Similarly, when we talk about thyroid hormone regulation, when there is increased T3 and T4, this inhibits the release of TSH from the pituitary gland, right? Or the TRH from the hypothalamus, which reduces the release of the eventual hormones of the thyroid gland, which is T3 and T4. Similarly, when blood calcium levels are low, parathyroid hormone is released, right? So calcium can be released from the bones. Otherwise, calcitonin was there, which was conserving your calcium levels in your bone, and it was not causing it to release into the blood. So whenever it is low, parathyroid hormone is produced, which causes the release, right? And eventually, when blood calcium levels are high, PKF production is reduced, so that it can be conserved. Oxytocin की example was already there. Prolactin की भी release होती है during lactation, right? So suckling a baby. I'm sorry, I just gave the wrong example for lactation. It was prolactin hormone. Oxytocin की contraction के लिए मैंने पिछली slide में थोड़ा सा इस चीज को it was a slip of tongue. Prolactin जो है आपकी lactation के लिए, oxytocin आपकी uterus contraction के लिए थी और certain other hormones की. सही है? Again, this is a repetition. आपको कोई भी पूछ सकते हैं कि एंडोक्राइन एक्सिस की कोई भी एग्जांपल दें, उसको एक्सप्लेन करें. सबसे क्लासिक एग्जांपल आपके पास हाइपोथैलेमिक पिट्यूटरी टारगेट ग्लैंड एक्सिस है. हाइपोथैलेमस आपके सर्कुलर हार्मोन्स रिलीज करता है, फिर वो इवेंचुअली आपका पिट्यूटरी फॉर एग्जांपल हाइपोथैलेमस ने रिलीज किया आपका थायराइड रिलीजिंग हार्मोन TRH, ठीक है. फिर पिट्यूटरी ने इसको रिलीज किया TSH, एंटीरियर पिट्यूटरी से आपका आया TSH. फिर TSH आपके टारगेट ग्लैंड फॉर एग्जांपल थायराइड ग्लैंड पे आपके एक्ट करेगा और वो प्रोड्यूस करेगा T3 T4. So this is your hypothalamic pituitary target gland axis, right? So the major endocrine axis include the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis and hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. तो बेसिकली इन्होंने तीन जगह पे क्या किया है, ऊपर नीचे तो बिल्कुल सेम है, टारगेट ग्लैंड को चेंज कर दिया. यहाँ पर एड्रिनल आ गया, यहाँ पर आपका थायराइड आ गया, यहाँ पर आपका गोनाडल आ गया, right? So the hypothalamus releases releasing hormones which stimulate the pituitary gland to release hormones that affect target glands like thyroid, adrenal glands, and the gonads. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis controls the stress response with the hypothalamus releasing corticotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the pituitary gland to release ACTH, which then stimulates the adrenal glands to release cortisol. अच्छा, अब जो भी आपकी बॉडी में हार्मोन्स हो रहे हैं उनके कुछ पैटर्न्स हो रहे हैं और ये बेसिकली बहुत आता है। ये मैं आस्क यू कि कॉर्टिसोल का क्या पैटर्न है? डायरेक्ट है कि दिन के किसी वक्त में इसकी प्रोडक्शन ज़्यादा होती है और दिन के बाकी टाइम में इसकी प्रोडक्शन कम होती है। कॉर्टिसोल के हाईएस्ट लेवल्स आर फाउंड इन women and lower in men. This is something that you guys need to understand. Then, when there's another phenomenon which is synergy and antagonism. Synergy क्या है कि एक हार्मोन दूसरे हार्मोन को सपोर्ट कर रहा है, उसको रेगुलेट कर रहा है, उसके लेवल्स को भी इंक्रीज कर रहा है। एंटेगोनिज्म क्या है कि उसका फंक्शन एक हार्मोन का फंक्शन दूसरे हार्मोन के फंक्शन के ऑपोजिट है। तो इंसुलिन और ग्लूकागॉन हम पहले डिस्कस कर चुके हैं, वो ऑपोजिट है। इंसुलिन क्या करता है? ग्लूकोज के अपटेक को बढ़ाता है टिश्यूज में, और ग्लूकागॉन क्या करता है? वो वहाँ से हटाता है और ब्लड शुगर लेवल्स को इंक्रीज करता है। तो ये एंटागोनिस्ट है। ग्रोथ हार्मोन एंड टेस्टोस्टेरोन ये क्या करते हैं? दोनों साइनर्जिस्टिक कोऑर्डिनेट्स हैं, सही है, आपकी प्रोटीन की एनाबॉलिज्म एंड फुल बॉडी कॉम्पोजिशन में कंट्रीब्यूट करें। एफएसएच और एलएचबी दोनों फॉलिकल की डेवलपमेंट करते हैं, ठीक है, और ओवुलेशन भी कॉज करते हैं मेंस्ट्रुअल साइकिल में। तो ये भी साइनर्जिस्टिक कोऑर्डिनेट्स है। दिस इज समथिंग दैट यू नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड। Classification of diseases, again, whenever we study a certain topic, it's very important that at the end of our lectures we cover the clinical scenarios and diseases or the pathologies we have to do whatever we study. आपकी जो एंडोक्राइन की डिजीज होती है उनको आप बहुत तरह क्लासिफाई कर सकते हैं। हार्मोन के एक्सेस हो गए, ठीक है, कैसे हो गए? प्राइमरी ग्लैंड की ओवर प्रोडक्शन की वजह से, सेकेंडरी टू एक्सेस प्रोफिट सब्सटेंस, किसी हार्मोन की डेफिशिएंसी हो, ठीक है, प्राइमरी ग्लैंड की फेलियर हो, हार्मोन हाइपरसेंसिटिविटी होगी या आपके इनएक्टिवेशन फेलियर ऑफ सर्टेन हार्मोन्स या टारगेट ऑर्गन जो है उसकी ओवर एक्टिविटी है रिसेप्टर्स की, हार्मोन रेजिस्टेंस ये आपके हार्मोन्स डेफिसिट तो नहीं है हार्मोन्स का, ना ही वो बहुत ज़्यादा है, लेकिन जो आपके टारगेट ऑर्गन्स पे रिसेप्टर्स हैं वो उसको रिस्पॉन्ड नहीं कर रहे, वो रेजिस्ट कर रहे हैं, दैट इज हार्मोन रेजिस्टेंस, जिसकी वजह से इवेंचुअली पाथवेज एक्टिविटीज फंक्शंस नहीं होते। अच्छा, these are a list of diseases which we shall later study individually. Diabetes insipidus, diabetes insipidus में क्या हो रहा है? ADH रिलीज नहीं हो रहा, ठीक है। ADH का क्या रहता है? आपका बॉडी वाटर को कंजर्व कर रहा है, ठीक है, फॉर एग्जाम्पल इन डायरिया। लेकिन जब आपका ADH रिलीज नहीं होगा तो योर बॉडी लूजेस टू मच वाटर एंड you're dehydrated. Then we have a syndrome of this is too much. SIADH is basically too much ADH release. जब आप बहुत ज़्यादा ADH रिलीज हो रहा है तो आपके एक्सेस वाटर बॉडी रिलीज हो रहा है, ठीक है। फिर आपके पास थोड़ी और एग्जांपल्स में है जिसमें आपका है एडिसन्स डिजीज एंड कशिंग्स डिजीज। एडिसन्स डिजीज आपका क्या है कि इसमें आपका कोर्टिसोल रिलीज नहीं हो रहा, और कशिंग्स में क्या हो रहा है? बहुत ज़्यादा। कशिंग्स के भी आपके इम्यून फेसेस होते हैं, ये हम इंडिविजुअली सारे जब देखेंगे तो हमें ये इसकी एक्सप्लेनेशन मिलेगी। हम पीके की बात करते हैं, पीके इज बेसिकली डायबिटिक कीटोएसिडोसिस, ठीक है। आपके इंसुलिन रिसेप्टर्स इसमें काम नहीं कर रहे थे, ठीक है, इंसुलिन रिसेप्टर्स काम नहीं करेंगे, ब्लड शुगर लेवल्स आपके रेगुलेट नहीं होंगे, हाइपरग्लाइसेमिया, कीटोन्स, एब्डोमिनल पेन, ये सब। फिर आपके पास एक और है, ये एक सिवियर डायबिटिक इमरजेंसी होती है आपकी, विच इज नोन एज हाइपरऑस्मोलर हाइपरग्लाइसेमिक नॉन कीटोटिक सिंड्रोम, ठीक है। इसमें भी आपकी यही है कि इंसुलिन रिसेप्टर्स जो है वो कम हो जाते हैं, ठीक है, और इसमें कीटोन बॉडीज नहीं होती, इसमें कीटोन बॉडीज होती हैं और पेन होता है, राइट। Then we have this hypo versus hyperthyroidism, ये आपको बहुत ज़्यादा आता है, this is something that you guys need to study in detail। hypo में obviously ये हो रहा है T3 T4 नहीं sufficiently produce हो रहे, ठीक है। इसके हम आगे जाके सिम्टम्स देखेंगे। हाइपोथायरॉयडिज्म में हर चीज़ आपकी मेटाबॉलिक एक्टिविटी रिड्यूस हो रही है, आपको लिथार्जी हो रही है, आपकी कॉन्स्टिपेशन हो रही है, कि आपकी गट की मूवमेंट रिड्यूस हो रही है, और आगे हम जाके देखते हैं। और हाइपोथायरॉयडिज्म में हर चीज़ ज़्यादा हो रही है, मेटाबॉलिक एक्टिविटी आपकी ज़्यादा होगी। मेटाबॉलिक एक्टिविटी की वजह से आपको क्या हो रहा है कि आपका वेट बहुत ज़्यादा जल्दी गिर रहा है, ठीक है। और हाइपोथायरॉयडिज्म में क्या हो रहा है, आपको मेटाबॉलिक एक्टिविटी रिड्यूस हो गई थी तो आपका वेट गेन हो गया, राइट। देन वी हैव दिस हाइपोपैराथायरॉयडिज्म। हाइपोपैराथायरॉयडिज्म का क्या मतलब है कि पीटीएच सफिशिएंटली रिलीज नहीं हो रहा है, तो आपकी लो कैल्शियम एंड हाई फॉस्फोरस लेवल हो रहा है। और जब हाइपर पैराथायरॉयडिज्म आपका इंक्रीज हो गया तो पीटीएच बेसिकली करता क्या था, रिलीज करता था ना कैल्शियम को बोन्स में से, तो अब आपको हाई कैल्शियम एंड लो फॉस्फोरस। दीज आर द सिम्टम्स अगैन। आपके लिथार्जी डिप्रेशन के साथ आ रहे हैं तो आपको हाइपोथायरॉयडिज्म हो सकता है, डायबिटीज मेलाइटिस हो सकता है। दीज आर ऑल योर डिफरेंशियल्स। आपसे ये भी पूछ सकते हैं पर्टिकुलर सिम्टम आपको पकड़ाती है और आपको इसके डिफरेंशियल्स, राइट। ये से सारे डिफरेंशियल है। वेट गेन है वो हाइपोथायरॉयडिज्म की वजह से भी हो सकता है और कशन सिंड्रोम में भी हो सकता है। वेट लॉस हो रहा है वो एड्रेनल इनसफिशिएंसी में भी हो सकता है, डायबिटीज में भी हो सकता है, थायराइड polyuria and polydipsia, while they are classic symptoms of diabetes mellitus, the hyperparathyroidism, heat intolerance, thyrotoxicosis, ठीक है। थायरोटॉक्सिकोसिस में होता है और पैल्पिटेशंस आती है। थायरोटॉक्सिकोसिस, फियोक्रोमोसाइटोमा, ये भी हम डिटेल में पढ़ेंगे। हेडेक बाद में पढ़ेंगे। हेडेक आपका एक्रोमेगाली, पिट्यूटरी एक्सेट्रा, मसल वीकनेस, ये सारी कंडीशंस हैं। एंड पोस्टली सर्टेन फीचर्स आपके जो होते हैं एक्रोमेगाली, एक्रोमेगाली जब हम बात करते हैं abnormally enlarged built होती है आपकी एक्रोमेगाली में, यूजुअली इन एडल्ट्स, तो इसको हम एक्रोमेगाली कहते हैं। दिस इज़ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। कौन सी आपने इन्वेस्टिगेशंस करानी है, ऑब्वियसली हिस्ट्री देखने से आप पहले स्टार्ट करते हैं। सर्टेन आपने ब्लड टेस्ट करवाने हैं, उसके बाद अगर आपको ब्लड टेस्ट में कुछ समझ नहीं आ रहा तो आपने इमेजिंग की तरफ जाना है। और इवेंचुअली अगर आपको किसी खदशा है कि कोई किसी किस्म का ट्यूमर हो सकता है, तो फिर आपने बायोप्सी की भी तरफ जाना है। आई थिंक दिस वाज अ pretty simple topic. And once you guys have a good understanding of the foundation of this module, you guys will be able to understand the other upcoming topics very easily. It's a very easy